Hi guys! In this video we'll be going over case 1 of the regional case set, titled Factory Farming. In short, the case is about the ethical questions surrounding industrial animal agriculture or factory farming. The case introduces factory farming as a very important industry because it supplies high quantities of animal products at cheap prices so that they're accessible to everyone. However, the case also explains that factory farming has many bad side effects, including animal cruelty, pollution and production of greenhouse gases, a disproportionate harming of low-income rural families, human health decline, and exploitation of farm workers. The 3 case questions revolve around how individuals like ourselves should approach factory farming, whether we should or should not support it, and why.
Okay, alright. The first question is very common, the structure of which follows many of the other cases in the set. Basically, a lot of these questions are going to be asking you if it's moral or immoral to do something. This one says, is it immoral to consume factory-farmed animal products? So there are certain aspects to look at when approaching this question. We could apply consequentialism here. For example, the case says that factory farming pollutes air, soil, water, and causes a bunch of human health problems like diabetes, obesity, and gastrointestinal diseases. And also the filthy environment is of course bad to workers working there and to the animals. So here the consequences of consuming factory farm products are being presented and could play a large part in your stance on deciding if it's immoral or not to continue eating factory produced animal products. And the next thing we can look at is the intention and moral obligations of human beings. So in other words, if you know the bad consequences on the environment and many other places, is it immoral for you to turn a blind eye for yourself and choose to ignore it? Now that was some of the things we could consider when coming up with a response and calculating a solution. So now we're going to look at some example commentary and questions that really takes this discussion to a new level. And as I read through these questions, you could kind of think deep to yourself and brainstorm possible responses if you are being asked. So first one, if it is immoral due to all of these harms to humans, animals, and environments, does it mean that we're obligated to take action? If so, to what degree are we required to take that action? And the next question is, what about the people that can't afford the family-owned farms and can only buy these cheap factory-produced products? Are you a bad person if you decide to eat factory-farmed products because of its price and your financial status? And following up with the last question, if you're rich and buying family farm products and buying these factory-produced products doesn't have really a large difference on you financially, are you to some extent more morally obligated to make that change? So you see how your response to one question can really generate a lot of ethical questions that come with it. Now we'll move on to the next question. So the second question says, is it unjust to prohibit factory-farmed animal products? Now, upon first hearing this question, I thought of individual rights. And one thing we can look at is the company in association with the government. So is the government allowed to shut off an active economic body that is doing these harmful things, even though it brings a lot of beneficial things to our country as well? And also considering the consumer's rights, is it ethically justified to take away this affordable, cheap food source that many families may rely on? And considering the workers, do they deserve a better working condition? Now, stepping away from discussing rights, we can view this again in a more consequential way. By prohibiting factory-farmed animal products, what are the consequences, either good or bad, to humans, environment, and animals? And to recap on the consequences we said earlier, first thing, the American food industry is affected. The environment will probably become better. A bunch of human health concerns can probably be addressed too, and the animal abuse condition will also improve. So all of these can become a part of your response on whether or not it is unjust to prohibit factory farmed animal products, using a consequential view and justifying using the consequences it might bring. So feel free to jump outside the box and consider other viewpoints that we might not have touched on. And again, following up with some deeper thought questions. Do we need reforms? If so, what reforms would you suggest? What can the government do to improve the situation? When considering these type of questions, where should we include animals? As in, where are they in terms of their rights compared to us? And lastly, factory farming is a massive industry. If we do decide to prohibit factory farming, where would the workers find new jobs? Can that be a potential consequence that we need to address?
The third question is, do facts about the individual efficacy of our actions affect our moral obligations? This question is the most directly related to the philosophical ideas we talked about at our last meeting. Essentially, it's asking whether or not actions like factory farming can be justified by their outcome. If we boil the question down even more, it comes to, should we use consequentialism or deontology to evaluate our actions? If you've forgotten what these terms mean, please don't worry. It'll take some time to get used to all the new vocab. For now, just know that consequentialism evaluates actions based on their results, or consequences, and deontology evaluates actions based on their intent. An interesting ethical question that has to do with these concepts is the baby Hitler question. If you could go back in time to 1889 and you came across a random baby, would you kill it? Probably not, right? But if you somehow knew that the baby was Adolf Hitler, would your decision still stay the same? A deontologist would choose to not kill the baby, no matter what, because from their point of view, the most direct intent of murder is to hurt someone, which is bad. However, a consequentialist would choose to kill baby Hitler. From their perspective, killing baby Hitler would ultimately result in millions of lives being saved. I think that most of us also default to consequentialism intuitively, because in our normal everyday lives, we evaluate our actions based on their consequences. You know, if you do your homework, you'll receive credit, but if you don't do your homework, you'll get a 0 on it. That's a more common example of consequentialist thinking. So now, let's apply consequentialism and deontology to this case. The intent of factory farming isn't necessarily to hurt people. Rather, it's to meet the growing consumer demand for cheap animal products. By this logic, a deontologist would see factory farming as a good thing because it has a good intent. However, a consequentialist would disagree. They would argue that even though factory farming has a good intent, it causes a lot of terrible things to fulfill that intent. A consequentialist would focus on the animal cruelty, pollution, targeting of rural communities, human health effects, and exploitation of farm workers. And they would say that all of these side effects of factory farming are completely unjustifiable. From this, it's pretty easy to tell that using consequentialism is a better and far more realistic way to approach this case. So far, most of the examples I've given you show how consequentialism is the better concept. But let's talk about the extremes. Is it possible to go too far? Let's say that I'm eating an apple while taking a walk, and when I finish eating that apple, I throw it towards a trash can. But somehow, my aim was really bad. So instead of going into the trash can, my apple flies towards a man who is standing near the trash can. Unfortunately, the man was yawning at the time, so the apple soars right into his mouth and he chokes on it and dies. Of course, this situation has a tiny chance of happening. In fact, the vast majority of the time, it won't happen. But that still leaves a tiny chance. So if a consequentialist looked at this situation, I would be at fault, because my action of throwing away an apple ultimately led to someone dying, which is a terrible consequence. Now, is this a realistic way of evaluating my actions? Of course not. I would have never been able to predict that throwing away my apple would cause someone to die. So in this case, consequentialism is clearly not the best way to gauge the morality of my action. This scenario demonstrates one of the pitfalls of consequentialism. We can't possibly predict all the different consequences of our actions. So now that we know this, how should we approach question 3? Well, we've seen how consequentialism is usually a pretty realistic way of evaluating actions, except for a few extreme scenarios when the consequences are completely unforeseen. So how about finding a compromise? we can say that the morality of our actions can be judged by their foreseeable or predictable outcomes. So to directly answer question 3, we can say that the efficacy of our actions, or the ability for our actions to produce certain results, affects our moral obligations only to the extent that we can predict the results of our actions. Going back to the case, this implies that people are morally obligated to not support factory farming because of the drawbacks and harms it causes, and we know that these drawbacks are very predictable because the case says for a fact that they are happening. Alright guys, that's a wrap on our first video explaining case 1. If you have any questions, please don't be afraid to reach out to us. You can email us at uhsethicsbowl@gmail.com or shoot us a message on our Instagram account. See you guys soon!